Hello there. So, as you may remember, in chapters 3 and 4 of In Their Own Words, Helen Keller by George Sullivan, we learned about Anne Sullivan, who came all the way to Alabama from the Perkins Institution in Boston to help Helen learn how to communicate. So, let's see. So, at the end of chapter 4, Helen Keller was not very receptive to Anne and her teaching methods, but let's see if that changes. Chapter 5, Great Steps. Helen's family had always allowed her to do exactly as she pleased. If she did not want to comb her hair, it remained uncombed. If she did not want to pick up her dolls, they remained scattered about her room. When Helen's mother or father tried to force her to do something she didn't want to do, Helen would boil with rage. Her habit was to scream and throw herself on the floor. Helen's mother and father could not stand her tantrums. They decided that life would be easier if they let their daughter do whatever she wanted to do. Her father especially felt this way. He could not bear to see Helen cry. So as I was explaining in the last video, because of Helen's disabilities, her parents didn't discipline her very much, and they kind of let her do whatever she wanted. However, as we saw, Annie Sullivan was kind of putting an end to that. So let's see how that continues to go. Soon after Annie Sullivan arrived, she realized that the Kellers were making a mistake. Helen had to be taught to behave. Otherwise, Annie knew that she would never be able to teach Helen anything. But Annie also realized that she could not control Helen unless she got her away from the family. She spoke to Captain Keller about moving with Helen out of the main house, away from the family. To Annie's surprise, Captain Keller agreed. He suggested that Helen and Annie move into the little house, the two-room house where Helen had been born. It was close to the main house, but it would allow Helen and Annie to be by themselves. The first few days in the little house were difficult. Helen kicked and screamed when she understood that she had to stay there. When she quieted down, she spent her time playing with her dolls. She would not let Anne touch her. Helen stayed in a bad temper for several days. She frequently gave the sign for her mother. At the same time, she would shake her head sadly. She played with her dolls more than usual. She would have nothing to do with Anne. Here's the little house where they stayed. Several days after Helen and Annie had been living together, the two had an early morning quarrel. Helen would not put on the clothes that Annie had given her to wear. Annie made Helen understand that she would have no breakfast until she got dressed. Around 10 o'clock that morning, Captain Keller happened to look through a window in the little house. He was surprised to see that his little girl was still in her nightgown. He was so upset that he decided that he would send that Yankee girl back to Boston. Sometimes that's what they used to call people from the North. They used to call them Yankees. Later, however, the captain changed his mind. Little by little, Helen began to change. There were still times that her temper flared, but her outbursts were not so violent. About 2 weeks after Helen and Annie had moved into the little house, Annie wrote a joyful letter to a friend at the Perkins Institution. My heart is singing for joy this morning. A miracle has happened. The little wild creature of 2 weeks ago has transformed into a gentle child. She is sitting by me as I write, her face serene and happy, crocheting a long red chain of Scotch wool. She lets me kiss her now, Annie's letter continued, and when she is in a particularly gentle mood, she will sit on my lap for a minute or two. The great step, the step that counts, has been taken. The great step would soon lead to an event that some people will call a miracle. So as you can see, Helen's starting to come around, right? And Annie Sullivan is becoming successful in her attempts to teach Helen how to behave and act like a normal child. Day after day, Annie spelled words into Helen's hand. Helen would then take Annie's hand and spell each word back. It was like a game to Helen, and she enjoyed it. But she did not link the words to the things they stood for. B-R-E-A-D was just a series of letters to Helen. She did not know that it meant a baked food. She has no idea yet, Annie Sullivan wrote, that everything has a name. Think about it. She didn't know that this is called a book or this is called a ring. She didn't know that all these objects have names. One day, Helen and Annie began their daily spelling lesson. Helen was in a restless mood. She was being difficult that day. Annie decided that they should take a break. They headed for the water pump at the back of the main house. Helen described what then happened in the story of my life, which is her book. Someone was drawing water, and my teacher placed my hand under the spout. As the cool stream gushed over one hand, she spelled into the other the word for water, first slowly, then rapidly. I stood still, my whole attention fixed upon the motions of her fingers. Suddenly, I felt as if somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that W-A-T-E-R meant the wonderful, cool something that was flowing over my hand. After Helen had spelled out water several times, she dropped to her knees and pointed to the ground and asked for its name. She pointed to the pump and asked for its name. Suddenly, she pointed to Annie and asked for her name. Annie slowly spelled out T-E-A-C-H-E-R. From that time on, Annie was teacher to Helen. Now Helen was eager to learn. Everything had a name, she wrote, and each name gave birth to a new thought. I learned a great many new words that day, Helen continued. I do not remember what they all were, but I do know that mother, father, sister, teacher were among them. It would have been difficult to find a happier child than I was as I lay in my crib at the close of that eventful day and lived over the joys it had brought me, and for the first time longed for a new day to come. So as you can see, Helen's starting to really turn a corner now. Anne has made it obvious to her that she now knows there's a connection between objects and names, as we saw with the water situation. Chapter 6. To read, to write. As soon as Helen learned what letters meant and that everything had a name, a new world opened up to her. I did nothing but explore with my hands and learn the name of every object that I touched, Helen later wrote. By the summer of 1887, Helen knew more than 400 words. She quickly learned how to use them to construct simple sentences. These she spelled out in Annie's hand. To learn about nature, Annie took Helen outdoors for many of her lessons. Miss Sullivan taught me to find beauty in the fragrant woods and every blade of grass, Helen wrote. Helen learned to tell one flower from another by touching the petals and the stems. She touched the leaves and the bark of different kinds of trees. Annie brought Helen to a nest of straw where a chicken was hatching eggs. She let Helen hold an egg in her hand as a baby chick pecked its way out. She also introduced Helen to a squirming baby piglet. That's a fun experience for any child. When the circus came to Tuscumbia, Annie was able to acquaint Helen with many animals that were unfamiliar to her. Helen got to feel the ears of a giraffe and shake hands with a trained bear. She hugged a lion cub and rode on an elephant. Doesn't that sound so fun? Sometimes lessons were held on the banks of the Tennessee River near the Keller home. I built dams of pebbles, made islands and lakes, and dug river beds, all for fun, and never dreamed that I was learning a lesson. She, meaning Annie, made raised maps in clay so that I could feel the mountain ridges and valleys and follow with my fingers the devious course of rivers. So it seems like Helen Keller is actually having fun as she learns, which is great, right? One summer day in 1887, Annie decided it was time to teach Helen to read. Annie had gotten several special books from the Perkins Institution. These books had their own words printed in raised letters. People who were blind could read these books with their fingertips. Remember, that's called Braille, right? And look, here's a picture of Helen with her dog. Looks like his name is Jumbo. Annie began by first spelling a letter into Helen's palm. Then she pressed Helen's fingertips to a piece of cardboard upon which the raised letter appeared. Annie and Helen went through the alphabet slowly, one letter at a time. And one day, Helen learned the entire raised letter alphabet. Then Helen learned to use the raised letters to form words. Next, she arranged the words into easy-to-understand sentences. As soon as Helen was able to do that, it was not hard for her to read simple books printed in raised letters. Helen loved to read. She became an eager reader for the rest of her life. She read, she said, everything in the shape of a printed page that has come within the reach of my fingertips. That spring, Helen also learned to write. To make letters and words, Helen used a special writing board. It had horizontal grooves about an inch apart. The grooves went from one edge of the board to the other. A sheet of paper was first placed over the board. Then, Helen would write letters on the paper, using the board's grooves as a guide. In shaping the letters, Helen had the pencil in her right hand. She used the index finger of her left hand to help out. It was hard work for Helen, demanding great effort. She ended a number of the first letters she wrote with the words, "I am tired," or "I am too tired to write more." One of Helen's first letters was addressed to her cousin Anna. It had no commas, periods, or other punctuation marks. It had no capital letters. It read, "Helen Wright, Anna George, will give Helen Apple Simpson, will shoot Bird Jack, will give Helen stick of candy, doctor will give Mildred medicine, mother will make Mildred new dress." And look, this is what Helen's signature looked like throughout the years as well. It changed as she got older. But imagine trying to learn how to read and write when you can't see or hear. How challenging that must be. So this is pretty impressive. Not long after Helen celebrated her 7th birthday, she faced another hard challenge. Annie wanted her to learn Braille. Braille was developed in 1824 by Louis Braille, a French teacher of people who are blind. People with visual impairments are able to read Braille by running their fingertips over raised dots. Helen was delighted by Braille. She much preferred producing words by Braille to writing with pencil on paper. With Braille, she could read whatever she wrote. As soon as Helen had become skilled in reading Braille, Annie introduced her to Braille books. By now, Helen's tantrums had ended. Her thirst to learn more continued to increase. Christmas that year was the happiest holiday the Kellers could remember. For the first time, Helen took an active part in the celebration. She and Annie prepared surprises for everyone. Helen was thrilled to find presents in the stocking she had hung. And there were also gifts for her on the table, at the door, and on all of the chairs. I will write many letters, she tapped into Annie's hand, and I will thank Santa Claus very much. And as you can see in this picture, this is what Braille looks like. It's a series of raised dots that represent letters and numbers. So that is all for chapters 5 and 6, but stay tuned and I will read you chapters 7 and 8 next. See you soon.